You're listening to The Real Investment Show.
And welcome back to the show this morning, 6:47 on this election day. That's right. Roll out of bed, get up, go vote. Put your coffee down. Time to get to work. It's almost 7 o'clock. Polls are opening here. I want to talk about just a couple of things here, as we kind of get ready to wrap up the show this morning. One is that, we've had a really sharp recovery in the markets since the March lows. And it's been good, right? We had this tremendous injection of stimulus that came in from the government as well as the Federal Reserve. The PPP program, Main Street Lending Program, the Federal Reserve started buying corporate bonds and junk bonds and everything else to try to bail out the markets, right? And we've written some articles about the dangerous side effect of trying to halt recessions and bailing out companies, et cetera. And as I was noting a second ago, particularly in the energy space, you've got to be careful about where you invest because of what's so-called a zombie company. There's a lot of value traps in the energy space you need to be particularly aware of. But this really kind of exists across the spectrum of the economy. We have more zombie companies now than at any other point in history that we know of. And again, what a zombie company is this is a company that only survives because they can borrow debt cheap to pay their other bills, right? And if interest rates move up, game over. So there's a good bit of risk in the markets. And we have taken on a bit of what's called moral hazard. And we wrote an article about this recently. If you go to our website, realinvestmentadvice.com, and just type in the search bar moral hazard, you'll find the article. But what moral hazard is, and it applies to a lot of things, right? Not just the financial markets. The definition of moral hazard is when people feel like they have insurance against risk, right? So there's some effect in place that says, I can take on a lot more risk because now I'm insured. Example, let's say you go to Las Vegas and the hotel says, hey, you know what? You're a special customer, so go ahead and go gamble, but we'll insure your first $100,000 worth of losses. So if you lose any money and if you lose $100,000, we'll reimburse you. Okay. So now you have this insurance. And so you go, okay. So with that, you know that you can go lose $100,000 and not really lose anything because you're insured against that loss. So you go take higher levels of risk. You bet on hands and take, do gaming that probably you normally wouldn't do because you have this insurance sitting in the background, right? I know that's a bit extreme, but you get the point. Same way in the markets. What the Federal Reserve has done is created this idea. And here's the interesting part. It's just an idea. It's not really insurance, right? But over the last decade, the Fed has repeatedly come in and injected capital into the markets, and that capital has nowhere to go but the financial markets because banks aren't going to loan it out. I mean, why am I going to loan you money when you're not going to pay me back when I can invest it? I can take that same money, invest it in the market, and make a guaranteed return, right? Why would I loan you money, right? This is why there's no monetary velocity in the markets. The money never leaves the financial system. And this is why you have a burgeoning wealth gap occurring all across the country, right? So the Fed has created this idea that there's insurance, that when the Fed acts, that stock prices go up. And there's certainly evidence that that's the case because that's what's happened. But there's actually no insurance. Investors are just taking on more and more risk with this idea that every time they get in trouble, the Fed will come in and bail the markets out. But in order to do that, it requires more and more and more debt to do it. And here's the irony of it. The bailouts are ruining capitalism. I've got an article coming out on this here next week. Capitalism is a system. And, we take a look at this, at capitalism, and people go, oh, I hate capitalism because, the rich people have all the money. I don't have anything. So capitalism sucks. It's broke, right? It's not. We just don't allow it to function. Capitalism has a Darwinian aspect to it. And if we allow capitalism to work, then the weak will perish and the strong will survive. Here's a good example for you. Let's go back to 2000. Turn of the century. I know for a lot of you that was a long time ago. By the way, I have to wish Brent happy anniversary today.
Why, thank you.
I went and looked back at my calendar. Today was the first day that I started to work for you in 2000.
Way back in the day.
Way back in the day. So today's our anniversary. 20 years.
Man. You don't look like you've aged a year.
I haven't. I have a special recipe. But here's the point, is that if we go back to 2000, and let's just assume that we'd allowed capitalism to function and work properly, what would have happened? Well, first of all, Enron, WorldCom, I know these are companies you probably have never even heard of, Global Crossing, they would have gone out of business. CEOs would have gone to jail, like Jeff Skilling and Bernie Ebbers. Oh, they did, right? We allowed capitalism to function back in 2000 during the dot-com crash. Weak companies went out of business. Strong companies survived. The economy went through a recession in 2001 and 2, came out of that recession, and was in a healthier position fundamentally and financially coming out of that recession. Now, in 2008, we decided that we didn't want to let that happen again. If we had allowed capitalism to work, guess what would not exist today? JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Bank of America. Those banks wouldn't exist. They wouldn't be here because they were all bailed out by the Federal Reserve. Goldman Sachs would not be here today. AIG, General Electric. There was a tremendous number of companies that were extremely and heavily leveraged that had taken on excess risk. And had it not been for the bailouts, those companies would not exist today. But that would be okay because now our banking system, instead of being comprised, 60% of our banking system comprised by 5 banks, we would have a much more diversified and healthy banking system across the entire country. But we failed to allow capitalism to work. Since then, we have continued to intervene into the markets. Continued bailouts, continued supports, continued stimulus, etc. And what we've encouraged is a ramp up in debt, both at the consumer level as well as the corporate level. We've got a more heavily leveraged economy than ever before, ever. We're running a $3+ trillion deficit on our way to 4. We've got debt in the economy currently at a 28 trillion, 26, 27, 28 trillion dollars now, ramping up very rapidly in a $19 trillion economy. And we all kind of sit around and scratch our heads and go, well, I can't figure out why we've got this big wealth gap between the rich and the poor. We can't figure out why we can't get wage growth to stick. We can't figure out why we can't get economic growth picked up above 2% because we have failed to allow capitalism to work. And this sounds, what I'm about to say sounds cruel, right? And every time I say this, people always email us like, it's cruel, that's terrible. You can't wish that on people. You've got to allow capitalism to work. People need to be allowed to file for bankruptcy. They need to lose stuff. And why do I say that? Because if you allow capitalism to work, all the people that took on all this debt to sustain their lifestyle, buy houses really they couldn't afford, buy cars they really shouldn't have, so forth and so on, they go through a bankruptcy process. Now, we think that's terrible, right? It's like, oh my gosh, we file bankruptcy, everybody loses everything, and they all just wind up out in the street, and they're all homeless. That's not the way it works. They go through the system, they file for bankruptcy, they shed their debt, they restructure themselves, and they move on. Yes, do they have to sell their house? Probably. They move into an apartment. It's not the end of the world, right? They still have a place to live. We used to shun people for a decade. If you had a bankruptcy on your filing, you couldn't get credit at all. Okay? Nowadays, nobody cares about bankruptcy. Get bankruptcy? Oh, good credit, bad credit, no worries, we'll give you credit. That's the environment we're in. And this is why we have the problems that we have, because we continue to extend credit to individuals that shouldn't be taking on more debt. And it has a negative impact to their economic wealth and prosperity over time, and creates this wealth gap within the country that we see today. And we can't make this connection. And yes, it sounds cruel and heartless to say we need to allow people to go through this process, but we need to allow people to go through this process so they can start over. If I refinance my house and I use a government program to lock myself into a house I couldn't afford to start with, now I'm locked into that house and I can't move to somewhere else in the country where I could get a better job. If I'm allowed to get myself out of the house, then I can move to where I can get a better job and I can start over. Starting over is not a bad thing. But this is the process, and this is the problem of not allowing capitalism to work, is that we foster the dark side of the process that leads to bigger wealth gaps, inequality, higher levels of debt. And the problem with all that is that as it continues to expand, growth rates slow, the wealth gap widens, and it creates the possibility for subsequent crises down the road because you've never resolved the debt problem to start with. That wraps up the show for the day. All these articles are on our website, realinvestmentadvice.com. That's realinvestmentadvice.com. Please get out of bed today. Go vote. Go do your duty and make sure that you vote your conscience. I mean, that's really all this comes down to. But pay attention to the markets and your money and let us know what we can do to help you. realinvestmentadvice.com. See you tomorrow.
Get daily investment news you can use, delivered at the speed of the internet. Sign up for the Real Investment Report now at realinvestmentadvice.com.
It's a rich man's world.